to the Decatur Book Festival and to a special event sponsored by Agnes Scott College. My name is Christine Cousins, and I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the College. Agnes Scott is proud of our long association with Decatur Book Festival and of our creative writing program. Our annual Writers Festival, with its statewide college creative writing contest, is the longest running literary event in the Southeast and will be 50 years old this spring. Please join us for this anniversary celebration in April with headliner and return festival guest Rita Dove and the production of an original play by Alumna Writers Festival contest winner Jacqueline Pardue Goldfinger. You can find out more about these exciting events on the college's website. Today I welcome you to what I know will be a fascinating reading and conversation with Agnes Scott's own professor of English, Nicole Stamant, and celebrated author and Georgia Poet Laureate, Chelsea Rathburn. Professor Stamant teaches ethnic American literatures and is a widely respected expert on the memoir as a literary form. The topic suggested by Chelsea Rathburn's most recent book of poems, Still Life with Mother and Knife, is voicing the unspeakable. Poetry is uniquely suited to opening difficult topics and revealing their knots and fissures, while offering language to help us bear their weight. In conversation and in poetry, we will face these topics together with Professor Nicole Stamant and poet Chelsea Rathburn.
It's an honor to be here in conversation with Georgia's Poet Laureate, the incomparable Chelsea Rathburn. Chelsea and her husband, the poet James Davis May, were among the first people my husband and I met when we moved to Decatur 9 years ago. They were full of kindness and generosity, and it has been a singular thrill to see the evolution of their poetry in their lives. I'm so fortunate to have the opportunity to have a conversation with Chelsea this morning about her beautiful poetry. Author of 3 full-length award-winning poetry collections, we're here today to discuss her most recent publication, Still Life with Mother and Knife, a collection selected as a New York Times New and Noteworthy Book, and which garnered the 2020 Eric Hoffer Book Award in Poetry, among other honors. Born in Jacksonville and raised in Miami, Chelsea has deep roots in the state of Georgia, where her mother's family has lived since the 1830s. She moved to Decatur in 2001 after completing graduate school at the University of Arkansas, then to the North Georgia mountains to teach at Young Harris College. She and her family are now located in Macon, where she is assistant professor of English and creative writing at Mercer University. In 2009, she received a poetry fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, and Chelsea's poems have appeared in the nation's most esteemed journals, including Poetry, The Atlantic Monthly, The New Republic, The Southern Review, The New England Review, and Plowshares, among others, like the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day series, which delivered her poem, Introduction to Mycology, into my inbox, along with millions of other inboxes in 2018. In a 2019 feature, NPR called Chelsea's work arresting and a gentle whirlwind, a phrase I like because it juxtaposes those two seemingly opposed forces of gentleness and of being overcome. Her work is startling, often providing the kind of turn that the title of this collection forecasts, Still Life with Mother and Knife. Paraprosdokian, the rhetorical term for this kind of surprise ending, suits this collection so well because her work, the poems themselves, and the kinds of subjects they engage and consider exceeds all expectations. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you crafted this collection. It's structured in 4 parts. It includes both an epigraph and a poem that sits outside of the 4-part structure, and all the titles of the poems in it are introductions to things. Introductions to statistic, introduction to home economics, to art history. So can you describe the process of crafting your collection?
Sure. Well, the book as a whole is concerned first and foremost with the female body. And so I think of the structure sometimes as looking like those models of atoms in science. other than my knowledge of science is not very good and it goes really wonky. But I think of, sort of at the core is the female body, and then kind of moving around it is different aspects, motherhood and childhood, motherhood and girlhood, and trauma and joy, and artists and creators on one side, and then artist models and nudes on the other, and sort of all of that rotating around. And so when I was working on the book, I started thinking about, I wanted to have interlocking structures, so that the different parts of the book spoke to each other and they were in conversation, kind of across the sections. The first section, I have to give credit to my late mentor, Claudia Emerson. I showed her a kind of sheaf of poems and said, I don't know what I'm doing here. And a few of them had the introduction titles. I think Introduction to Statistics was in there, and maybe Introduction to Captivity. And I remember her kind of shuffling through these poems and then taking out a pen and writing Introduction in front of the titles of a few others. And she goes, okay, here you go, you have a series. All right, these are elegies for girlhood. I'm like, okay. She says, okay, go write the book, write the rest of the book around that. I was like, oh, sure, Claudia, you make it seem so easy. Absolutely. But that was the initial kind of impetus for that structure. Was I thought, okay, the first section will be about girlhood, and then I moved into pregnancy, and then the I don't want to say the aftermath of pregnancy, but kind of the challenging, say, months and years of early motherhood. And then I realized, the book was really dark, and so I wanted to try to bring in at least a little bit of joy, toward the end, kind of looking at, after maybe some of the adjustments of motherhood.
I love that. I love the idea that it's this atom, right, this atomic structure, and that there are these shades of positives and negatives and darks and lights and resonances across binaries. That's so beautiful.
Yeah, I think my science is a little bit fuzzy there.
It's okay. It's a science I can get behind. Would you mind reading the first poem for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book starts with an epigraph, which initially was an epigraph to the first poem. And then I realized that I thought it spoke to the collection as a whole. So this comes from Bruno Bettelheim's Uses of Enchantment. And Bettelheim was a psychologist who wrote really beautifully about sort of in defense of fairy tales, but not the Disneyfied fairy tales, but the original, the really dark, gory fairy tales. He thought that hearing these dark stories, allowed children to kind of process basically conflicting feelings about their parents. Right? So the quote is, "The child wonders who or what projects him into adversity, and what can prevent this from happening to him. Are there benevolent powers in addition to his parents? Are his parents benevolent powers?" So that's a question that hangs over the book. This idea that there are dark forces out and about, and sometimes those dark forces are indeed the parents themselves. So this is Postpartum, a fairy tale. The pages of our storybook childhoods were ripped from the Brothers Grimm, the woods always in shadow, the apples poisoned, the ladders made of bone, our mothers telling us early how much they loved and loathed us, how my aunt had wished to find my cousin drowned in the washing machine, while my mother hoped her cat would climb the walls of my crib and steal my breath. Our longed-for endings told gleefully and in the passive voice. Those days were gone, they told us, but we wondered. If, as Bettelheim writes, the witches and giants in the brutal fairy tales are really stand-ins for the parents the child is afraid to fear and love, what did we make of our mother's revelations, which made us the monstrous creatures, changelings left by trolls? That they could not or would not save us, that we had to learn to walk the woods alone.
Thank you. It's a poem that, has sort of been haunting me since I first read the collection, and I think is so beautiful and powerful in its engagement with those motifs that were, common and we're familiar with from fairy tales, but also sort of ambiguity and tension buried in those tales.
Yeah.
In the relationships that we have with them and with the people who told them to.
Right, and the stories that we tell ourselves about motherhood and about childhood. Yeah, my female relatives really did jokingly talk about their murderous fantasies, and which, I've thought a lot about that. What did that mean? To be really small and be told repeatedly, I wish that the cat would suffocate you in your crib, and what did that do? Right? I think it casts a kind of shadow. I was really scared to show that poem to my mother.
What did she say?
She laughed. She thought it was, she's got a good sense of humor, but she supported it.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. These feelings are so powerful, and they are conflicting both for the child and for the parent. And you have both these senses of enormous adoration and love, and also the sense that you yourself might be obliterated by this other being. One of the things that I love so much about this collection is that it does take as its center these complicated relationships, right? It's not simply parents are wonderful or children are wonderful or something, because that's nonsense. And so, as you pointed out in this collection, specifically mothers and children, and maybe even more specifically mothers and daughters. The title of that poem, of course, calls to mind thinking about postpartum depression, and that is both routinely ignored and or seen as a source of shame. And the conversation today, of course, is titled Voicing the Unspeakable. And so there are a number of conventionally unspeakable topics that you address in this collection, not just postpartum depression, but grief and embodied anxiety and middle-aged libido and anxiety about children.
Child molestation is in there.
Molestation. Yeah.
It's fun.
It's hard, and thinking about loss and thinking about maternal ambivalence. And so, as you can so concisely put it in Postpartum Lullaby, which is of course a later poem, she croons aloud, the unallowed, that the things that are unspeakable. So for many writers, and for many women writers in particular, these issues are still unallowed. I was teaching Mad Woman in the Attic recently to students, and they were still surprised at how many things in that collection continue to be unspeakable. Thinking about madness, thinking about illness, thinking about embodiment. So I guess, I'm curious to know why you think it's so important to continue to say the unallowed, to write about the things that are unfortunately continual sources of shame and taboo.
I think, I remember when Addie, our daughter was born, I thought, first I thought I could not possibly have postpartum depression because it did not match those stories, the murderous stories that my female relatives had told me. And I was also convinced that if anybody knew what I was going through, that my baby would be taken away from me, that I would be, put in a hospital. I wasn't thinking rationally. And so I was determined that nobody really know what the depths of what I was experiencing. And I was also unable to articulate it even to myself, like exactly what was going on. And so, I remember at the time, people giving me really well-meaning, really beautiful books about the beauty of motherhood, and the beauty of birth and all of this. And I, just wanting to throw these things across the room, because it just did not represent my experience. And so specifically thinking about postpartum and about early motherhood, I sort of wanted to write the book. I felt very invisible for a long time. And so I wanted to write a book that said to anybody else, you are visible, right? You are seen. And a way of, I suppose I wrote the book that I wished that I had, exploring the poems that I wished somebody had given me at the time.
I think, the allowed, the unallowed is just so crucial. And, for so many people, parents and people generally, having a book like this to help them navigate those silent spaces is so important. Can you talk a little bit about your strategies for rendering that pain into language, which seems from a non-poetic person almost impossible to do?
Mm-hmm. I can try. Right? This is so interesting. I write often about motherhood. I write very much about being a woman in the world, and I also I teach currently at Mercer University, and I teach poetry workshops, and I also have taught, not currently, but I've taught memoir. And so I'm also in that space. I navigate these questions, but I'm also trying to help my students navigate them. And as you know, teaching here at Agnes Scott, these young people in college are navigating all sorts of painful subjects, right? And there's always that question of, well, how do you, as you said, render? How do you render pain into art? Because I think there's a stage where, if it's too raw, it just feels it's extremely uncomfortable for the reader, right? Or it feels like chaos, just this mass of unfiltered pain, right? And so, first I with my students, and I suppose with myself too, I just sort of say, okay, first step is permission. Give permission to write it all. Just write it all. Write all of it. Don't censor. And then somewhere along the way, you have to start thinking about, okay, well, how can these experiences be shaped, right? By metaphor, by formal structures, maybe. How can we give containers to grief, to anger, to loneliness, right? Because and that's one thing that poems do so well, because we're looking for ways to compress language and to shape experience. And so sometimes it's looking at external structures. I have some poems dealing with very difficult subjects that I've cast in the form of Petrarchan sonnets, which is that's a difficult form, right? But it provides this nice container to kind of rein in some of that unruly material. But also, with my students, I encourage them, this poetry can lie its way to the truth. We can make adjustments. John Chardy said that, right? He's paraphrasing Picasso, who said art lies its way to the truth. But we can lie our way to the truth too. We have a responsibility, I think, as artists trying to reach readers of crafting the material and shaping it, and sometimes realizing that maybe changing some details or shifting pronouns, right, can render the experience maybe more clearly or more truthfully for a reader, maybe than sticking to the absolute facts of the experience. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Is there a poem in the collection that came to you really quickly and easily that you didn't have to sort of shape into a particular container, or was there one that was especially unruly and unwilling to be manipulated?
That's a great question. Right? I was struck. I was listening. I watched, I think, probably like just about everybody who's watching us today. I watched Jericho Brown's keynote, and I felt so good. There was a moment where Jericho said something to the effect of, well, when you've finished one book and you're starting something else, you don't really know what you're doing, right? You're just kind of accumulating some things and then waiting for it to take shape. So I'm in that space right now where I'm thinking about a next book, waiting for it to take shape. And so looking back at my last book now, it sort of seems like, oh, everything came together so easily, because I'm really in the weeds right now going,
Sure.
what do I do with all of this? So in a way, from this vantage point, it seems like they just, came together easily. I remember a poem that you mentioned in the introduction is Introduction to Mycology, which is an elegy writing about a very painful subject. It was a friend who was murdered in a workplace massacre. And that, oddly enough, was a poem that once I figured out an oblique angle, which was to talk about species of mushrooms, I feel as though that poem wrote itself. And I look back, some of my drafts are 20 or 30 pages long, you know, for poems that end up this size. And that was a poem that did not seem to go through very many drafts. It sort of arrived fully formed. But then there's another one, the one that actually in the book is right after it, is called Introduction to Art History. And that was a poem that I wrote very consciously. I knew I needed a poem to end this first section, the introductions, and I needed it to be called Introduction to Art History. So it was a situation where I had the title first, and the entire time I was writing the book, I kept trying drafts of this poem, and they were failing and failing. And eventually what I ended up doing was realizing, I can write 3 small poems and give them Roman numerals and stick them all under this one heading, because it was like I couldn't say everything at once.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And so what I ended up doing was two of the 3 sections reference specific works of art, and then the middle one is sort of an imaginary art history slideshow. And so it's describing female artists.
Can you explain how you knew you needed that one next?
Yeah, like why Introduction to Art History? Because a chunk of the book is in conversation with Eugene Delacroix's paintings, sketches and paintings of Medea. And I also, in the book, write about having been an artist model when I was in college. And so I've sort of been on both sides, you know, the person being sketched and then the viewer of artwork. And I appreciate both. And so I wanted a poem that was going to sort of tie all of that together.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
The collection's focus on the Medea poems is especially interesting. And, you know, the ekphraistic nature of them, both in Introduction to Art History and then in the sort of Medea set, right? Mm-hmm. It's just marvelous and fascinating. And I'm curious to know if you could describe why you found Medea such a compelling, I mean, she's compelling, there's no question, but why you found her so useful or central to the collection, and then maybe if it's just Medea, but it seems like it's Delacroix's Medea in particular.
Absolutely, it's Delacroix's Medea. So in the poem Introduction to Art History, I mentioned that I loathed French Romantic art. I hated it. And I hated Delacroix in particular. I particularly did not like the fact that his women were always wearing skirts, but they didn't have shirts on. You know, why are these, they're these bare breasts, and they're you know, well, the women bare-breasted for no apparent reason, right? It's like, what is this? But I was kind of still really in the thick of postpartum depression. And I was teaching a world history literature survey class, you know, very introductory level, early ancient, in the ancients. And so I was teaching it around the theme of vengeance. And I was teaching Euripides' play Medea. And basically I was looking for images to put on a PowerPoint. And I was, you know, flipping around the internet as we do. And I came across this painting, this Delacroix painting. I'd never seen it before. And it was like something clicked. Like I looked at this painting and I fell in love with it. And I didn't understand why. And if you don't know the myth of Medea, I mean, the play is phenomenal. But, you know, the myth is Medea was married to Jason. Jason goes off and marries another woman, political marriage. And in an act of revenge, she ends up slaughtering their children to cause him pain. And she is conflicted about it in the play. But in Delacroix's painting, the painting shows so much ambivalence. And it's called, I mean, the translation is Furious Medea. But there is no fury at all in the painting. You know, her face is just incredibly soft and beautiful. And I don't know, it spoke to me in this really strange, powerful way. And so I started reading everything that I could about the painting, and I started finding what I read confused me. It seemed like people were talking about 2 different paintings at once, and then I realized, oh, there are multiple versions. You know, there's a copy that he did that's in the Louvre. The original is in Lille, and so I ended up cashing all of my frequent flyer miles in it was 2015, flying to France by myself. It was right after the bombings there. It was kind of a scary time. The massacres there. We were apart. My daughter and I were apart for the first time. This was all important, yes. Because it was strange. It was like this moment where it was kind of reclaiming myself and saying, okay, well, my poetry matters to me, enough to go this way and leave her.
Absolutely.
But I actually got to sit with about 40 sketches that are not on public display, but actually go into this office of this museum and hold Delacroix sketches.
Oh, extraordinary.
It was really extraordinary. But yeah, that is it grew out of me trying to understand, like, what is it about this painting? Yeah. So, and the poem that's titled after the painting sort of tries to explain that.
Would you read it for us?
Yeah, I will. So this is Medea Furious, 1838. Furious Medea, Delacroix called her, but I can see no rage, unless we count her breasts, twin weapons pointing fiercely at us, or the hand clenching a dagger, its shadow slicing her nearest child's leg. There is disorder in her hair and robes, but her face, caught in profile, reveals what we might read as sadness, a jaw too soft for anger. The painting's tension lies in the lack of fury, in the illusion that she might be guarding the boys, in our knowledge that she is not. And the children in her arms, they know it too. The one half-hugged, half-throttled squirms away. The other is folded in a pose so close to the surrender of nursing, he seems at peace, almost, before his eye, open wide and looking directly at us. How many times have I seen that look, the flash of fear on my young daughter's face when I have raged at her or some small thing? It passes, the fury and the terror. My daughter puts on socks, the driver yields, but I'm left shaken, a stranger. Maybe all mothers murder their children's innocence. In the painting, Medea holds her boys so close they're one body again, two cords she must cut. The children have no choice but to love the hand that holds the knife.
Thank you.
That poem always makes me sad when I read it.
Yes, it is. It's hard to come out of it. I mean, which is so important to this collection, right? Mm-hmm. When I was reading it, to prepare for our conversation, rereading it, I found myself needing to put it down a lot, which is obviously the right thing to do with poetry. You shouldn't just breeze through a collection, but sometimes wanting to go into my own daughter's room and just make sure she's still there and, arrange her blankets and then remind myself that everyone is a person and everybody is fine. Just a kind of silly response, perhaps. But I think, when you are channeling this engagement with this text, one of the things that I find just so powerfully wonderful and startling is your response to both Medea as a person in the painting and to, of course, Delacroix's construction and conceptualization of her, and the maternal ambivalence that you're describing, mm-hmm. and the artistic engagement, mm-hmm. with that indecisiveness and that, and the guilt that mothers feel. Right. Before we started recording, you said something about, we're dealing with the challenges of pandemic and parenting during the pandemic, and slouching into month 7. Right. You mentioned the losing your temper a little, and I thought, I've been there so many thousands of times. Yeah. I mean, I think that this is a great question. How are you handling parenting now? I mean, you're teaching, you're parenting, mm-hmm. There are so many things that you and I and people watching are negotiating. Right. How are you doing? We're doing well, somewhat, I think. We're in a strange situation because Mercer went back face to face, and so we're
teaching with masks on, but it's great to have the students back in the room with me. But we are teaching with masks on. But Bibb County schools are virtual and just started recently. They didn't start until after Labor Day. And so, our daughter is still home. She's very social. She's home all the time. We haven't had a break from her. She hasn't had a break from us. But we're actually, I feel like the summer, as difficult as it was, as scary as it was, stressful, it was really also a nice opportunity for our family to get closer. We got to know our daughter in a way that we didn't before. And she's 8 now, and she's really kind of coming into this. She's this amazing person of her own. We're in the poems in the book. She's still this sort of half-formed creature, right? And now she writes her own poems and she draws, and she's wonderful. I've got a quick anecdote. In 2018, Delacroix came to New York City. There was a really big exhibit at the Met, and so my husband and I flew up to New York to see the painting again. And like I said, I have a strange relationship with it. I refer to Delacroix's Medea as she. I sort of in my mind, kind of have conversations with her. I know this sounds, very odd. But anyway, at some point I had mentioned to our daughter, this painting's very important to mommy, and I have this woman in the painting, I have a relationship with her, and I guess I had said, well, she did a bad thing. And so as we were preparing to go up to New York, Addie comes along and she says, Mommy, the woman in the painting, the one you have a relationship with, what bad thing did she do? And I thought, do I tell her? Yeah, I guess I'd tell her. I said, well, she killed her children. And she said, let me see the painting. And she looks at the painting, and it's the moment, she's holding the knife in the painting. And Addie looks and she says, I think she's trying to save the boys with the knife. She's going to use the knife to save the boys. I was like, that is Addie.
Yeah.
She's so sweet and optimistic. And look, that's great. Yes. We're gonna keep that reading for now. Yeah.
It's important to have your own reading.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's been so hard, and this collection speaks to that tension, right? The grief, the anxiety, all of these emotions that are normal and commonplace, but also because they are unspeakable, are often rendered or made unnormal,
invisible,
right. And unnatural.
Yeah.
And I'm optimistic, and maybe this might be too much of an Addie reading too, but that because we are sitting with one another, sitting with our families, we're with our families all the time. Mm-hmm. Or at least I am, and you are. Other people are able to see the complexities of these emotions and the ways in which there are complicated feelings, and kids are having their own complicated feelings, of course. And it's been incredibly challenging, but I hope, like you, other people are also finding windows into
a little bit of solace. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's complicated being a human.
Right. Right.
I think it's really been challenging, parents navigating this. And I also think about, friends of mine who are single, unpartnered, don't have children, who are navigating the isolation of this pandemic in completely different ways too.
Well, and Addie, as an only child, that's really complicated. My kids have each other, and they're not terribly close in age, but they're close enough that they can play and create their worlds. And
yes. My poor daughter has not seen a child in person since March 17th.
That's so hard.
I mean it. She's had virtual play dates since March. She's socialized with adults that have come to our house. And I just think, oh, you poor kid. Right.
What kind of poetry does she write? Do you and Jim help her with her poetry? How exciting to have two poet parents.
Oh, no, we're not allowed to help. No. She's very strong-willed and independent. Yeah. And she writes poems. Some of them rhyme, some of them don't. Jim and I gave a reading before we left the mountains gave a reading that started with an open mic, and so Addie asked if she could read one of her poems, and
how wonderful.
Yeah, she performed one of her poems.
Yeah. She's very brave. No surprise. I can't wait to get her collection. So you mentioned, that I write about life writing, and I teach it, and I teach a literary analysis of life writing, not the creative elements. But as someone who does think a lot about self-representation, my favorite lines in the collection come from Selfportrait in Wood or Stone or Air, which is the last poem of the collection. And you talked a little bit about how you help your students come to sort of write about really difficult and challenging moments and situations and emotions. And I'm curious to know how you talk to them about writing autobiographically. As teachers of literary criticism, we always say, don't conflate the poet and the speaker. And I have done absolutely that every time I've read this collection. And
yeah, we do that. We do that in the workshops, in the poetry workshops too. Where we're doing this funny dance where we'll say, well, the speaker. We were saying the speaker, and then we're saying, well, you, right? And then eventually, whoever's poem is up for discussion, will say, it is me, right? It's me. I'm the speaker, And then we say, oh, okay, all right, we can stop doing this whole dance,
right?
But sometimes, sometimes they bring things in, and we're reading them autobiographically, and it turns out that it's. I had a student last year who didn't like to write about her life, and so she would, watch CSI Miami or something, and she'd come in, and we'd be asking her some questions about the poem, and it would turn out it was the plot of a TV show she thought was interesting. So you really can't, you can't assume, right? But yeah, the thing I always think about, and I try to tell my students, whether I'm teaching memoir or poetry, is as we said, people are complicated. We are not one self, we're not one unified self. And, I always tell them I'm a different person in the classroom, of course, than I am at home with my husband. I'm a different person with my kid. I'm a different person with the president of my university, or, all of these situations. We have all these aspects of the self. And so, I think anytime you have an I in a poem, there's still a sense that it's a persona, right? Even if we're writing the autobiography, right? We're still, in some sense, projecting a construction of the self.
So you see this as autobiographical, this collection?
Oh, definitely.
And what about your other collections?
I have never been able to get out of my own head, right? Out of my own life. I suppose I do write poetry somewhat to make sense of the world and to make sense of my life. I will say one reason I think I'm drawn to writing about art, writing, ekphrastic poetry, is that it does help me get away from myself a bit. Sure. It gives me a frame so that I can access experience obliquely, right? And I actually don't try to help my students do this. I'm forcing them. My narrative workshop this semester is doing a researched poetry project where they have to find some niche that they're interested in and research it and then turn it into a poetic sequence.
That sounds great.
Because I find it's helpful for all of us, to have some way of accessing, giving us language, giving us metaphors, some way of discussing the issues that we care about, but maybe not always head on.
Yeah.
Kind of coming around this side.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so that was what Medea ended up doing for me. It gave me this external framework to talk about what I saw as, my failings as a mother, my failings as, I wasn't supposed to have postpartum, right? I wasn't supposed to lose my temper at my kid. I wasn't supposed to do this or this or that. And being able to talk about Medea was a lot easier to work those concerns in, rather than just flat out saying them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you write about your body too, in something like Incompetent Cervix, which is like such a fantastic and challenging and harrowing title, the expectation.
It's a terrible term.
It's a terrible term. The expectations, right? What a competent cervix would do.
Right.
Exposing the ways in which the terminology both medicalizes you and renders you disabled in lots of ways, and the,
Incompetent.
Yes. The stitch that you write about is both you and not you, and of course this is what it is like to bear a child in one's body, right? To negotiate the you-ness and the not you. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you navigate these embodied moments, right? Not just like not being able to get out of your own head, which many of us can't, but also not being able, in some sense, to get out of your own body, which, so many of these poems the speaker would like to be able to do.
I think one thing that I do is I look for some sort of form to get me out, like the poem Incompetent, Cervix. Yeah, it's about, I had a complication during pregnancy, right, that resulted in having to have an emergency cerclage, which is where your cervix is sewn shut. And, the poem Incompetent Cervix, I'm looking at this is a sonnet. And the stitch is not a particular form, but it's rhyming, and it's 3 lines, 2 lines, 3 lines, 2 lines, and the rhymes kind of weave in and out. Yeah. And so what I was trying to go for was sort of the, stitching. And that, again, that gave me a kind of shape to maybe distract myself from the fact that I was talking about very personal subjects. Yeah. And so I need that sometimes. I need that sort of, that sense of distraction. Yeah. And then I have a poem like Postpartum Lullaby, where that poem, and I should say I almost never read poems from this section of the book out loud. Yeah. But that poem Postpartum Lullaby, which is specifically about postpartum fantasies, I don't use the word I in it except when I'm quoting the she's thoughts, right? It's the I appears, but everything is like, oh, it's not really me. There's this pronoun she. It's a she. It's a she. Right? It's me. Yeah.
But also, it's not just you, right? And again, right. I mean, having that weigh in, giving that voice to so many people who don't have the ability to put these things into form, right? Or the ability to refract, those emotions. You do this in some of the references that you make throughout the collection too. In that particular one, the last line is a reference to a Sandra Boynton book. Maurice Sendak shows up. How do you engage the extra textual elements of your collection?
You caught that Boynton. I didn't think anybody would ever.
Oh, I have read that.
There is. Can I read that?
Oh, of course.
Yeah. It occurs to me, I'm not sure I've ever read this in public. This is Postpartum Lullaby, and I was going for the sort of child board books, kind of. So it's very rhymey, very rhythmic. So, Postpartum Lullaby. When 2:30, midnight, 10, when the baby cries again, when at her breast a parasite, when she is up and down all night, a voice like a wound in her head, in her ear, a rational wound, calm and clear. By day she whispers promises, by day she smiles and swaddles and kisses. By night, beneath a callous moon, when she alone can soothe, she croons aloud, aloud, the unallowed. I want to blow my brains out now. And still they rock and rock and rock beside a cold, indifferent clock. So that was, I mentioned my experience with postpartum depression did not match my relatives because I never once wanted to hurt my child. I just fantasized about vanishing, like ceasing to exist. Yeah. I would be in bed rocking this squalling little monster creature. She cried all the time. She only stopped crying if she was asleep, basically, or feeding. But I would rock this thing and think, I'm the worst mother in the world. I'm the worst mother in the world. I want to disappear. Right? It was that kind of intensity. But you can't write. I couldn't write 50 pages of that. No. Right? Like that poem is too. It's a little. I'm voicing the unspeakable a little too much.
Well, and right? I think as you're I mean, your reading was just gorgeous, and it reminds us of lots of those word books, right? The clock and the moon and the things that are fixtures in the room. I mean, it's Goodnight Moon and it's Centerpointed and it's all of these things that we read over and over and over and that become part of a parental lexicon. And here you are able to so beautifully use those images to connect with people who have been in similar positions, to both say aloud the unallowed and make a connection across time and space, you know, to give her, to see her, right, to render her visible again, which is just so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's strange, you know, looking back, I don't know, to think it really was Medea that kind of saved me. You know, it was that I got interested in this project about a mother who murdered her children. And that was what kind of, and you know, part of it was the getting absorbed in a project again, and then going to France. But it felt, I think there was also an aspect of, well, I'm not as bad as Medea, right? I may feel like a bad mother. I'm not as bad as Medea, right? Get that?
Yeah, to be unalone, right? And not alone with not just a tiny person screaming all the time, because that doesn't really make you feel less alone. It's very isolating. Yeah. Thank you for reading that. I know that was.
Yeah, I got a little choked up. It's yeah, I don't know that I've read that publicly.
Wow.
Yeah, I almost never. Usually, if I give readings from the book, like longer readings from the book, I read, you know, from the first section, and then I just say, and there's a section I don't read. We don't talk about it. No. You know, you buy the book.
Thank you. One of the things that I like, I mean, I've said that 16 times now, it's so true, is how your research informs your writing. And so often people might think that creative writers don't do any research, and obviously they are very wrong. So, you know, talking about Medea and being able to go to Lille and to see the art and to hold the art and to, you know, commune with it in a kind of sense. And to think about lots of different kinds of texts that populate the collection. So the word books and, you know, images from popular culture and Playboy and, you know, combining those texts with your own experience is one of the elements of this collection that makes it so rich. Could you talk a little bit more perhaps about what it's like to do research in the service of a text where you're not footnoting and referencing everyone?
Yeah, it's a different kind of research.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah, I was actually introducing this research poetry project to my students this week and sort of explaining. I said, well, you know, for you all, you hear research and you think library databases, and when I think research, I'm thinking Google Street View, right? And digital photo archives, and I'm looking up. What were the Playboy centerfolds in the 1980s that I remember seeing around, because it seemed like everybody's brothers had these things lying around. Yeah, for me, a lot of it's visual. It's looking up, you know, music, and you know, sometimes it's looking at historical documents. I'm doing some work right now. I'm still in a very chasing different threads and sort of trying to see what's going to turn into something useful. So I'm reading pretty widely, but I've been reading a lot of books about the history of Miami, Florida, which is where I grew up, and looking at some writings by some naturalists who were down in Miami at the turn of the 20th century. My family settled there they were early settlers, pioneers. So I have a great-great-grandfather who was on the Miami City Commission, first City Commission in 1906. And you know, so I've been doing all of this research on, you know, well, what did the city look like in 1906, 1920, walking around a neighborhood that's basically doesn't exist anymore, but there's still these little pockets of houses, you know, here and there. The old architecture is there. Again, doing Google Street View, and I can't physically be someplace. So research, I think for the poet, research tends to be this very physical process. Like
It
we're
sounds
trying to
immersive.
yeah, it's immersive, and we're trying to sort of embody like what does it feel like to be, what would it have felt like to be in this space, right? And it's impressionistic, right? Much more so than, you know, when I'm doing scholarly research or when I'm writing memoir, right? Where I'm like really trying to make sure that the things that I remember match historical fact. Right. When I'm researching for poetry, it's a different game.
It sounds fun.
Yeah, it is fun. It is fun. I mean, it's sometimes frustrating because I can spend days where I'm not learning anything new. I'm reading something and somebody refers to some botanist, and I'm like, oh, I haven't heard of him yet, you know, and I go track down, oh, look, he's got a book, and I could find it on eBay, and now I've got to wait for this book, and oh, wait, no, it wasn't actually that interesting. You know, it's this sort of this very strange process, but it is fun. Yeah. And there's this point right now where I have an idea of a possible book. You know, there are poems that are poems. And I have this kind of fuzzy idea of what the book may shape into, but it's not far enough along to.
Did we get any previews?
No.
But you're writing.
I am writing. Yeah, I'm writing. And I'm writing poems about Georgia also, but mainly, kind of mixing back and forth this stuff about history, the history of Florida, my personal history, family. It's dealing with social class, working class.
That sounds wonderful.
Constructions of the self, I suppose. Maybe a little bit of climate change thrown in there. So you can tell I'm all over the place with it. So again, just kind of seeing where what emerges.
It must be an exciting point to be at. I mean, a little unsettling in terms of how wide it still might seem, but it sounds like an exciting place to be. Dynamic.
Yeah. I had planned originally on spending much of the summer down in South Florida and doing some more work than I did, but you know, coronavirus had a way of changing some of that.
As it does for so many things. Well, thank you so much, Chelsea. This has been just an absolute and total honor and pleasure. And
thanks for having me. And I know I was supposed to do a reading at Agnes Scott last spring.
I was devastated.
It was one of the many things that was canceled. But yeah, it's a pleasure.
This is even better in some way.
Yeah, and thank you so much it's such a generous reading of my book.
Oh, it's all in there. It's so brilliant. You're so lucky.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Thank you for having me.
We are so excited to be able to have a Q&A together, even though we're not still sitting at Agnes Scott's beautiful campus. How are you doing, Chelsea?
I'm good. I have to say this was one of the weirder experiences that I've had. We recorded this conversation, about 10 days ago?
Yeah.
And then to be watching myself on my computer and then joining via Zoom is just incredibly odd. But
is.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I realized I didn't say in our initial conversation, I don't think I ever expressed just how grateful I am to the Decatur Book Festival. I lived in Decatur for, I think, 12 years. And I was, involved with the festival, attending the festival just as a fan. I've read there a few times. This is still my hometown book festival. And it's just really been wonderful this year watching Joy Pope as the director, moving this whole thing online. It's just been awesome. And thank you, Nicole, too, for.
Oh, I feel the same way.
Beautiful questions and.
Having lived in Decatur now for 9 years, moving here as part of the English department, Agnes Scott, that was the selling point. They were like, oh, this is the Decatur Book Festival. And when my husband and I realized what that meant, we were like, we are in a very, very perfect place. It's a dream place with a dream community, and we feel really lucky, and I feel totally honored to have been invited to be in conversation with you. So we have lots of exciting questions, and I didn't have to write any of them, so that's also a bonus. They're coming from lots of different minds, I assume from all over the country, which is of course another wonderful element of, not being able to be in person. At least we can hear from people who wouldn't necessarily have the chance to be in Decatur. The first question is about your daughter, which I suppose isn't really much of a surprise. The question is, now that your daughter is older, do you still find content in the conflicting emotions of motherhood, or was the power of those heightened in the earlier months necessary to fuel the artistic moment?
Oh, that's a great question. I definitely do still find the content. I find inspiration in my relationship with my daughter. But she is 8.5 now. And, she is very much her own person, and writing her own poems and writing her own stories. And so I've been hesitant, really, I've written some poems about her experience, or my experience with her, that I wrote after the book. In fact, I wrote something very recently, but I'm not sure that I'm going to publish those, or at least I might wait until she's a little bit older, to weigh in and say whether she wants me to.
Yeah, something about getting older and moving into whole personhood and self-recognition, and
right.
I think that's very generous of you to give her a little bit of space.
Yeah.
The second question is about genre. So, do you write in other genres? Might we expect a novel from the summer of Macon /COVID /motherhood?
I write nonfiction.
And I also write a little, I dabble in drama. So I am currently working on a play off and on. And I do write nonfiction, short essays mostly. And fiction, you've all heard some of my poetry. I'm very much an autobiographical poet. It should surprise nobody that kind of my preferred prose genre is also nonfiction.
Yeah, I love the idea of you writing a play. I want to go to there. Mm-hmm. I will be first in line. Okay.
It's a stubborn play right now. It's not.
Well, they tend to do that, I suppose. The next question is about your direct poetic influences for still life. Can you share what those were? And can you think of any books that mothers should be reading during the pandemic to feel less alone?
Gosh. Well, I'm telling you, when I was a new mother, I definitely wasn't reading the right things. I was not reading the right things. I wasn't reading anything that was giving me any solace. I recently, University of Georgia Press has published a book by Chelsea Dingman called Through a Small Ghost, which deals with a stillbirth. It's a really beautiful book, and also motherhood. That one comes to mind right now, but that was sort of after the fact. I really love Natasha Trethewey's work, and particularly, her book Thrall, the way that it handles. It's often a lot of her poems in that book are in dialogue with works of art, and so that was definitely one that I remember returning to when I was working on Still Life, and specifically looking at how does another poet handle these conversations with art, and also picking it up at one point. I was worried the book was getting too dark, and then I thought, Thrall that's a dark book.
Yeah,
this is okay. I can dwell on the darkness.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Oh, and I thought of somebody else too. The poet Alicia Stallings, A.E. Stallings, who is, she is originally from Decatur. She lives in Athens, Greece now. But she's written also just really beautifully about her children when they were small.
Yeah. Do you know Louise Erdrich's Blue Jays Dance? Have you read that one?
I haven't read that one.
That was one when my oldest was an infant. I returned to. I had read it in graduate school, and it's a sort of composite of her children's young infancy, and I always have found that to be sort of helpful as well. We could come up with a reading list too, if the questioner would like us to.
You probably should.
Yeah, I'm in. The next question is maybe a little bit of a challenging one for those of us who work in the academy and, you know, mostly sometimes play by its rules, I suppose. So the question is, do you think that the academy, which is admittedly not monolithic, continues to shape the topics that are unspeakable for women writers?
I mean, my gut answer is yes. I think so. Nicole, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so too. Although
I feel like it's changing.
My hope is that it is. You know, my hope is that when people like you publish works like this, we have more of an opportunity in the academy as academics to show students and readers and public reading audiences more generally what we're writing against and what the traditions are. You know, I mentioned Mad Woman in the Attic during our conversation, and, you know, that book, a former colleague of mine, when I started to teach it, said, you have to teach this book like it changes the world, because when it was published, which was well before I was in the academy, he said it changed the way everyone understood women writers. And, you know, of course, something like Mad Woman goes a long way in doing that. There's still plenty of space for exposing things that are unspeakable and speaking them, right? Aloud, the unallowed. And students of mine, some of whom are here, will know that that's exactly the kind of thing that I encourage them to write about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking one of the best classes I took in college was it was a special topics class. It was specifically women's memoir. And, you know, thinking about sort of the permission to write, and
Yes.
It was a literature class, but the professor as a final project said, okay, well, now you all have to write. And I think we may have had one male student in the class, but it was mainly, you know, it was all, probably entirely female. And basically it was like, okay, well, now you all need to write a chapter of a memoir. You know, it was like this, I don't know how to do this, but, you know, this permission granting, that was great. This semester I'm teaching modernism. And so a literature class, and we're reading Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. And you know, there are very few women poets from that era that are sort of held up in the same esteem. And I'm always struck when I'm teaching the female modernists how unfeminine their work seems. You know, as though most of them sort of intentionally distanced themselves from femininity.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, Gertrude Stein not letting you in past the salon, right? And pairing herself with the geniuses, and Alice gets to be with the wives, you know. I think those silences and those spaces and the continued interrogation, right, that we get, though, we get something like the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, and we get Stein sort of writing in tender buttons, fracturing things, you know, demanding that we look at things and look at them differently, which I find essential. You know, for me, similarly in college, it was classes on women memoirists that were the ones that changed my positions. And I was at a women's college, and there weren't enough classes that were doing that there then. So, you know, I think about those issues and concerns when I'm shaping my classes, you know, for Agnes Scott students. And I did it when I was at Texas A&M too. So, The next question is very different. It's a process question. In revision, how do you move from the raw, painful first draft to the final draft without censoring out the meat of the piece?
Wow, that's a tough question. That is a really tough question. When I revise, so I think one of the things that student writers and younger writers, or people sort of early on the path, often don't realize, I think, how many drafts poets often go through. I write and write and write and write and write and write. And sometimes my students seem horrified to find out, this probably went through 50 drafts. And I'm like, what? I'm like, no. Some of those drafts were changing one word, or moving a few things around. The small scale revisions. But no, I suppose that I try to just consciously, I check in occasionally with the energy of the poem. There is a way sometimes, I think, when we're revising that some of the initial impulses can be cut away, sanitized in a way. And I think that we have to look for that energy. Sometimes I will try inserting a statement. If I feel like I'm losing that energy, I might try putting in a statement something like, but what I want to say is, right? Or what I wish I could say, what I can't write about is, those sorts of statements, because they can kind of serve as like a correction back. If I feel like that I can't remember the exact wording of the question, but that sort of like the painful raw energy. If I've lost that, if I feel like I need to get back to the heart of something important, like a statement like that, but what I'm trying to tell you is blank. And then just sort of starting again in that kind of, free writing, more generative mode, that can be helpful. And
I assume you save all of your drafts.
Oh yeah, of course. Well, what I do is I work in one giant document. And so the current iteration of a poem is just sort of like up at the top, and I just continually copy and paste. And so I'll copy it, I'll paste it back at the end, and then I'll go back and make changes. And so that way nothing's destroyed, it's all there. And so
it's so important. And I think that's such a useful piece of information. I was recently reading Roscoe's Book of Delights, and he's writing about writing, and which I find so beautiful, and writing about sort of his pen and the importance of the pen on the paper, and how when he's writing prose, he doesn't work on a computer or word processor. He's writing it out longhand. And as someone who does not usually do that, I'm always curious to know like the mode that people are writing in, especially when this is what you do, and when you have such a close connection to the words, right? The pen and the words and the typing. The copy and paste is a little less intimate sometimes, yeah. But I think it is a reality, right? It's much closer to what many of us do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something about that, just sort of the copy and paste, it lets me move it, it's not destroyed. And I do primarily, I type rather than write. I think because I go through so many drafts.
It makes sense to me.
Saves me, yeah.
Speaking of typing, will you be teaching online anywhere, anytime soon?
No, not at the moment. Not at the moment. I currently have my hands full. Mercer is face-to-face. So we are through the pandemic. We have been so far. Our COVID numbers are very good, but we've been in person, teaching through the masks, socially distanced, and but it's exhausting, to try to deliver the same energy of a classroom when we're all in neat rows and socially distanced and masked, and it's working well. But at the moment, at the moment, no, I'm just teaching my undergrads at Mercer, and maybe in the spring, I might teach a workshop here or there.
Well, you'll have to keep us posted. What aspects of Georgia are you writing about now, Poet Laureate?
What aspects of Georgia? Oh, that's a good question. I recently wrote a tribute. I really don't want to say much more than I will right now about this poem, but it was occasioned for an event. I have written a poem that is a tribute to a Georgia musician, and I'm very excited about it. Sort of my relationship with this, the work of a Georgia born and bred musician whose work just moves me deeply. Yeah. And I hope to, some point, now that I'm in Macon, I'm much closer to the town where my grandfather was born, a small town. There's not, my understanding is there's not much to see there, and the old farmstead burned down, but I plan to make a trip down there sometime soon and kind of walk the land, and not sure what'll come of that.
Well, we're all excited to see whatever is next. I mean, it's always a privilege to read your work. The last question that we have for this evening is, who is writing encaustic poetry today?
Who's writing ekphrastic poetry?
It says encaustic. My assumption is that it means ekphrastic. But.
Okay. I'm trying to think. I mean, Natasha Trethewey. I think again, somebody who's wonderful. Ekphrastic poetry isn't just about art. It's also films and music, and it's just kind of any sort of engagement with the arts. I'm trying to remember the book that the sequence comes in. My friend and poet I admire greatly, Juliana Gray. I think this is in a book of hers called Role Play. She has a series of poems that are in dialogue with Alfred Hitchcock films.
Marvelous.
It's a sequence. Each poem is in dialogue with a different Hitchcock film, and they're brilliant. They're really, really great. So that comes to mind as well. That's all I'm thinking of right off the top of my head.
I love that you're reminding us that it isn't just paintings, right? I mean, often we think of things like Landscape with the Fall of Icarus, and that is what we think of, and that is important and wonderful, speaking of modernism. But also, there are lots of other media and lots of other artistic productions that poetry is in conversation with and should be in conversation with. Mm-hmm. I think Hitchcock is a fascinating person to have your poetry.
I do too.
Well, again, it has been such a delight. You and I talked about both attending SAMLA virtually after we had our conversation. So virtually, you and I will be there. Can you tell us what you're hosting at SAMLA?
Oh yeah, this is the South Atlantic Modern Language Association conference. So it is an academic conference, but I put together a panel on, it's not voicing the unspeakable. That's courting. I think it's courting scandal. It's basically a panel on, I don't want to say confessionalism, but kind of like disclosure, self-disclosure, sort of the risks and pleasures of disclosing the self. And so we have a couple of nonfiction writers are going to be on there, and some poets, and talking about kind of the dangers of putting yourself out there, and also what's rewarding about it.
Sounds so fun.
I need to write a paper still, but I'm going to be writing something about the concealment, revealing the self, but while also being that revealing aspects of the self in some ways it's sort of like a sleight of hand. You're able to conceal other aspects of the self.
It's really a tight walk. I mean,
it's like a rhetorical strategy.
Yeah, it's so important. Well, I can't wait to see you there. See you like this on the screen.
I get the early morning, Sunday early panel, so.
I think one of mine, I'm hosting an undergraduate research forum with some Agnes Scott students on queer life writing, and ours is Friday morning. So similarly, we're bright-eyed anyway, kids and all. Oh, Chelsea, it has been so much fun to get to talk to you again. It's like a double bonus. I feel very grateful, and it's been just an honor. So thank you to the Decatur Book Festival for having me, and to Agnes Scott for hosting us in our conversation.
Absolutely. Nicole, thanks again for being such a wonderful reader of the book. And again,
It's better than reading.
And it's been again so lovely to be part of the Decatur Book Festival this year, even though it couldn't happen in person. It's been really great. So big shout out to Joy and the whole team at DBF.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice night.